Okay, so I'll start. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. Welcome to xyzpodcast. I'm Gary, and it's very strange and funny, and at the same time, and knowing Sally is like a test to my understanding of network. You can never know that how far a person knows each other. There's a very interesting statement saying the 6 degree of separation. In fact, maybe the person next to you, you are just very close. You might know from friends to friends or friends. And Sally was one of the panelists in our first event of PAM event on writing culture, along with Afendi and also I forgot the guy names from London. He's also a associate, no, not associate, but assistant architect or project architect in David AJ office. So I thought to invite Salis to join in today's discussion, and I thought, oh yeah, Thomas, thanks Joey. And I thought to invite Salis to talk about culture. I know it's a big word, but of course, from culture, I think one of the things that impressed me the most is actually Sali's presentation on TEDx talking about beauty. And one particular slide, she was talking about Mona Lisa and also the visitors in galleries. And that makes me, to further explore the understanding of beauty in how accessible in a way is it only accessible for those who can afford to go into the Louvre and also a certain museums. They are sort of like a high art, but Sali's publication and also her narratives much more focused on the unknown culture, which is pretty much today we are going to talk about it. So today is actually the third one, and thanks for joining us. And then I hope that throughout the conversation, you can type in the chat box if you have any thoughts. Okay.
Okay.
So without further ado, hi Sally.
Hello.
It's
Hi,
really nice
Gary.
to see you again. I hope you are doing well in your new place, isn't it?
I am. I'm actually today in a very cloudy environment. The clouds are so low that I can barely see outside the window.
But because last time before the event, you show a little bit of the landscape as well, and then you
Yes.
are sort of staying in a
In the middle of
room
nowhere.
in the middle of nowhere. I think it's kind of reflect to your personality and also your works. How do you see the art or perhaps culture in a rather subtle and also humble way instead of flamboyant or extravagant way? Um, I think that's pretty much kind of related to your upbringing or also your personal journey as well. In the book called Hitokoto, there are two books actually I got. Of course, there are more actually. I think Sally been working on. So one is Hitokoto, one is Spaces. So Hitokoto, you mentioned in the opening, the introduction, you mentioned you were born in Yokohama, but then you move on. Your parents moved to Paris, right? Since
Yeah.
you're small. So I wonder
Yeah.
how does that influence your understanding of culture, especially this kind of cross culture.
Mm.
You growing up in France, and then when you revisit Japan, how does it feels like?
Mm. Actually, I when I was a child, so my parents moved to Paris when I was 2 years old.
Mm,
So I started school in France. So when I started school in France, I couldn't speak French, obviously. And I learned French in 6 months or something. I was fluent in because I was so young. I was fluent after 6 months. I could speak French. So my whole entire family was like stunned.
mm,
And then after moving, I didn't go back to Japan until I was 8 years old.
right,
So it's a long time. And after that, from 8 to 25, I didn't go to Japan at all. I never
right.
visited Japan because actually my parents were not so strongly attached to Japan and didn't go back. My grandparents would come to Europe. And
Mm,
so I really didn't have any connection with Japan at all. I mean, I didn't really feel I mean, obviously, I was a Japanese person, but I didn't have any connection with my home country. So
Mm.
when I went back, when I was 25 years old, I went back because I had some work with a Japanese company, uh, and I landed. I mean, I arrived in Shinjuku in Tokyo, and I was like, I had no idea where to go, or how to. I don't know if you've ever been to Shinjuku, but it's like it's the largest station in the world. It has 3.5 million passengers per day passing through.
Mm. Mm.
So yeah, I mean, I was like in the middle of Tokyo, and I didn't really know what was happening, and I don't read Chinese characters,
Mm.
so I cannot read Japanese. And so yeah, I can speak Japanese, but I don't read and write. So it's a very strange feeling for me to, when I go there, especially at the time when I was 25, I just couldn't really figure
Mm.
out at first.
Mm.
And then after that, I started going back to Japan more and more often. So I started to kind of reconnect myself to my roots,
Yeah.
and I became more and more interested in my home country, and I wanted to explore more and discover more and understand more about Japan. And I also realized after a while that actually I was a Japanese person. It's kind of a strange. Something that didn't happen immediately,
Mm.
but as I grew older, I realized that all of the things that I couldn't figure out when I was in France, because when I was growing up in France, I only had French friends or friends who were of other origins, not necessarily French.
Mm.
They were Spanish people or Algerians or, different. I mean, France is, especially Paris, is very mixed. So I had friends from all different backgrounds, but I was the only Japanese student throughout my entire school years in France. There were no
Mm.
other Japanese people. And we were like 1,300 students, for example, in high school. I was the only Japanese person. There were Chinese people, Vietnamese, other Asians, but no Japanese.
Right.
So, so basically, when I was growing up in France, I didn't really. There were things I couldn't really feel like that I fit into. I felt like I didn't fit anywhere, but I didn't really know why. And it's only until I went to Japan I figured out, oh, actually, the reason why I didn't really feel like I was at home, in France is because I'm a
Mm.
Japanese person. So
Mm.
only when I arrived in Japan, I realized, oh, this feels so natural. The way
Mm.
things were done. Like I felt like, oh, this feels like me. It's strange to say that. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know
Mm.
how, DNA is such a powerful thing that,
Yeah.
you know, but
Yeah.
I'm someone who never really spent time in Japan. But somehow when I went back, I really felt that there were certain things that spoke to me in a way that could never speak to me in the same way when I was in France, that I was
Right.
totally disconnected.
Right.
So, yeah, so in that sense, Japan became, in a way, like my distant home country. And that's what Hitokoto, the book Hitokoto, is about that.
Mm. Mm.
And I think that the way I perceive things in many ways is I have a quite Japanese sensibility to things. But my culture is also very French because I grew up here and I went to school here.
Yeah.
So I have a very French way of thinking too. I criticize a lot of things.
Yes. And then because in Hitokoto you quoted quite a few French philosophers and
Yeah,
statements as well. And I think Hitokoto is a very personal to you, how to bridge this French and Japanese culture at one time. But then I think the book also comes at a very refreshing point of view because it's sort of like a revisit after so many years, isn't it? And
yeah,
it feels like to re-understand your home country in a way. But I wanted to ask because um you were growing up in France, but you sort of have that memory perhaps in but maybe too little, 1 or 2 years old, maybe it's quite early to remember. I'm not sure if you can remember anything, but do you think like you yourself, even though you're born in Japan, but spend most of your time in France, does that makes you a global citizen in a way it doesn't really matter where is my birth country,
yeah,
it's much more on adapt to the place where you're growing up, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think that the fact that I don't really belong to any country. Today,
Right.
I can still say that I don't belong to France or Japan When I'm in Japan, I feel very European. When I'm in Europe, I feel very Asian. Actually, it's a kind of funny contrast. So I do think that the fact that I don't belong anywhere makes me quite open about every culture that I meet or people that I meet. That I never, I don't really think in a way that because I'm from a specific place, I look at things from that specific angle. I can see things from different angles. So I can see things from a Western angle or from an Eastern angle. You know, East West is always, there is this kind of dichotomy of you know, whether you're like a Western person or Eastern person. Is a, you know, many people make you know, kind of understand the
Comparison,
world.
yeah.
Yeah, they're always this comparison, and I think it's a true. I mean, it's a real thing that Western people, Eastern people are very different. I mean, there is such a reality. In my case, I think I'm, you know, because I don't belong anywhere, I have both worlds within, so I can see things from those two perspectives, and I look at everything from that sort of double angle or multiple angle, and it makes me see things in a sense that probably is not typical. You know, it's not a typical way of seeing things, but I feel lucky to have this open way of seeing, because it's a way, it's a, you know, it's a kind of 360 degrees perspective that is not obvious for many people. You know, they see things through a certain angle and they have a hard time seeing from the other side.
Right.
So I feel privileged in a sense.
I think this kind of ambiguity allows you to work very organic and also very flexible in different kind of places, because you yourself, I believe your work allows you to, you know, to explore, especially because when I was looking up to your website, there are lots of works in Southeast Asia or in Asia, like let's say Taiwan or Myanmar, Thailand. So I believe that works also allows you to be open for all sort of culture, all sort of people. It's much more. It doesn't have to be specific, but I think the specific idea will comes very focused when you talk to the local communities. You have to understand a certain so-called rituals. I would like to ask, like, how did you get involved into UNESCO and working there for quite a while? But before that, you were studying about visual art, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, you know, I studied fine arts and communication design, and after I graduated from the RCA in London, you know, I was looking for a job. I mean, I was basically like this typical communication design person looking for commercial work or, you know, that kind of stuff, and hanging out with designers, you know, the creative type of people. But I was also like looking for a job. I was thinking like, okay, how am I going to make a living? And you know, obviously everybody knows that it's hard to make a living from being a visual artist or, you know, that sort of thing. And I just found like this announcement, I don't remember where, there was this announcement saying that UNESCO was recruiting young professionals, and you had to have you had to fit in a certain, like there were criteria, like you had to come from a country that was not well represented in the organization. You had to speak, I mean, ideally you had to speak French and English fluently, which was for me like, wow, you know, it's me. And Japan, at the time I was a Japanese citizen, and Japan didn't have enough Japanese staff members in UNESCO. So I had the Japanese passport and I had the French and English thing. So I thought, oh, maybe I'm just going to apply. But I didn't know anything about UNESCO. To be honest, I didn't even know about World Heritage at the time. I was totally ignorant. And I mean, that's, you know, that's how it happened. And I submitted an application, and it was like really tedious. You have to submit something to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of your home country. I mean, it was crazy. And then, you know, I waited and I didn't hear from them for 1 year. I mean, I really thought that, and I mean, at the time I was working in a sandwich shop and I was making sandwiches
Right.
to make a living. And you know, one day I was in the sandwich shop and I got an email from UNESCO saying, you were selected for an interview. Do you want to come for an interview? I was
Right.
like, wow, you know.
But after 1 year though.
After 1 year, I was invited for the interview, and it was not just an interview. It was like an exam. There was a language exam. It was like crazy. It was like going back to university again, but even worse. and you had to do some tests in a classroom. You were interviewed by like dozens of people. The whole thing took like 2 weeks, just the interview process.
Right.
And then I think maybe like 2 or 3 months later, they told me that I was hired. And it was really a surprise for me because all of the other candidates, the other candidates were Ivy League students. I mean, like they were like graduates from Harvard School of Administration or, international relations type of people. I was the only person with an art degree. And it was kind of like, what is she doing here? All of the other candidates were looking at me and they were all wearing gray suits. I was the only person wearing colorful clothes, and I looked like a nutcase. And all of the other people were wearing gray suits. They were very formal, typical political students type, or the people you see at LSE or something like that.
Right.
And and I got this position, which was actually a lifetime. I later resigned, from UNESCO, but initially I had this lifetime post as a young professional, which evolves into, you become, eventually after 20 years, you become a director, and you do all kinds of high-ranking things. You have a diplomatic passport and all that.
Yep.
But yeah, so I started there, and but I resigned actually after 4 years because I think I was too weird. I didn't really, I was very young. I was in my mid-20s when I joined UNESCO. It's a very young age.
Right.
I was a bit of a rebel. I mean, I'm still a rebel, but back then it was worse because I was from art school, and people from art schools are like a pain. You probably know that. They always have their ego, and so I was a bit of one of those people.
Yeah, and then because I'm not sure from art school, I think pretty much the same in a way. We are tend to produce things to justify our work. Like I did this poster, this is my work and time spent here. But I wonder working in UNESCO is kind of different. It's not much more on, graphics, isn't it? It's much more on writing and proposal workshops.
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, there was nothing creative about the work. So when I joined, I was basically an office, part of the administration, but I belonged to the culture sector. So I did, and I was also doing public relations at the very beginning. I was sent to the United Nations Pavilion during a world exhibition in Japan. So I was a PR agent, or like a PR, officer, and I was organizing a lot of events and designing brochures and stuff like that. So there was a creative side to the job. It's not just like writing reports and filing documents. There was something creative about it. And I slowly discovered that within something very bureaucratic, you can bring a creative side. And I really felt that my role was to be the creative person inside this very gray bureaucratic environment.
Right.
So I think that was, I felt like I had a role to play because everything was so gray in a way that I could add the colorful bits as a creative person. And I slowly discovered afterwards the social impact of creativity. How can we influence decisions that are made? How can we make creativity useful for the world? So that's kind of how it developed.
Yeah, and I think working in UNESCO also allows you to see through different kind of lenses. I think for example, this assignment is a UNESCO assignment, and also this one is design DNA, even though it's not particular with the UNESCO, isn't it? But I thought to ask, like, what were the inspirations for you to go through this process, or this sector? I believe it's kind of accidental as well, because you kind of not expected it to be happen as well, because you didn't mention it's like after 1 year of application you might think it's gonna just give up, might as well just give up, but it just comes back, isn't it? But what draws, I mean, is there any personal factor that draws you saying that you wanted to do something more on culture side? I mean, you could have just do like a designer or make a commercial living.
Yeah, I think there are two reasons. The one reason why I decided to join UNESCO was I actually wanted to break away from the design community, as
Mm,
in the
mm,
conventional one. I wanted to do design or creativity that has something more, that had more of a purpose beyond just the aesthetics and the, the design as in, the conventional design. That was back in those days, I think there weren't as many talks about social impact. And that's today there is a lot, social entrepreneurs. But back in those days, it was very rare for designers to do things that had any social meaning. It was much more about the creative stuff, the
mm,
commercial works.
mm,
And so I wanted to, UNESCO felt like, oh, this is a place where I could be creative, but in a different way.
mm,
The other thing about UNESCO, I think, is that I always wanted to do something international. For me, there was something that because of my background, it's very hard for me to work in a place that is only with people from one place. I need something very mixed, international, people with different backgrounds. So that sort of UN environment was very appealing because I knew that there would be people from 190 countries. There would be like so many different stories to hear from the different people. So I felt like were the main reasons why I joined,
mm,
and that later kind of evolved into something else because eventually I did leave the organization, but I continued as a consultant, um, with more freedom.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. I quite like this photo that you sent. It says
Mm.
that when you make a thing, it's by Picasso, isn't it?
Yeah.
It says when you make a thing that is new, it is so complicated, making it that is bound to be ugly. And I wonder, you did mention this kind of social enterprise and also cultural studies is kind of new at that point of time. I wonder what was your earliest work. Now, of course, what we are seeing now is, it has been it has been a process that after so many years of you working with different kind of people. So I wonder what was the earliest work, especially when talking about cultural studies and craft.
Yeah. Well, actually, so just to explain, this book is a book I found in UNESCO's library when I was a young staff member. It's a famous book by Victor Papanek, which
Mm,
now many designers know about, called Design for the Real World. And Victor Papanek is one of the designers who worked with UNESCO in the 70s
mm,
to deliver social impact in different, regions in the world. And so this was the first time I realized when I saw this book that there were designers who worked in this kind of situation. It made me realize, oh, and this was done in the 70s, so that was a long way back. And I felt like, oh, we should do more of this kind of stuff today. And it sort of inspired me to think about the role of the designer, I don't really like the word development, but it is development work of how to improve life, basically, or how to make, uh, life easier for, people in certain contexts. So, yeah, so this was, the book that triggered my interest. To go back to your question of, which was my first project, uh, that really tackles this sort of the social impact areas. I think that when I was in UNESCO, I was part of I was managing a program called Creative Cities Network,
mm,
and back then we had many partners, and we worked also with some uh, design schools. And one of the schools actually sent some interns. It was Art Center in California that had this program called Design Matters.
mm,
I don't know if you know about it, but it is a social design program, social innovation program that sends students to different organizations to basically create projects that have social impact. And back then, I think it was Creative Cities Network and some creative programs that I was involved in. We decided to have an intern from Art Center to design stuff for the organization and to be involved. So that was, I think, the earliest that hands-on, like social innovation and design type of project that I did. And later on, with the Creative Cities Network, we had many people who worked on this idea of how to improve life. So not only city officials, but also there was this big thing about how to improve life in urban areas. I mean, it's still a big topic because there's so many so we started to work on those kind of what can designers do, how can designers think about culture again, and their identity in their placemaking, these kind of things. We thought about initiating projects like that. So Design DNA, this one is a workshop. This was done after I left UNESCO, but it was part of this Creative Cities program with the city of Nagoya in Japan. So the lady who was at the time, she was the president or the director of the International Design Center there. She and I actually conceived the framework of this workshop. So it was about what is in Nagoya, what kind of stuff do they have, and how can young designers think about or redesign stuff around local assets. So we had traditional craft. We had things like train stations, food stalls, and designers would kind of think about solutions, whether it was signage or packaging or communication. It would cover a range of stuff. And this workshop was done, I think it was a week-long workshop, and we had students from all over Asia. So it wasn't just Japanese. It was like there were some from China, some from Taiwan, and we actually even had some facilitators from other countries like South Africa, Australia. It was pretty intense. And at the end of the workshop, there was a big presentation, and the people actually pitched their ideas to big companies. So we had people like CEOs from big corporations from Japan, who would possibly like say, okay, I want to invest in this idea, maybe we can make this real. It was quite exciting. I don't know what happened afterwards. I don't know if anything became real or not, but there were this organization, the International Design Center, has very big stakeholders. I mean, like Toyota and like people like that, because Nagoya is one of the wealthiest places in Japan, because it has all of the car makers, industry people. So we had huge sponsorship and kind of support because of the location. It's very industrial, and it has also a lot of crafts. So it's kind of an interesting place because it has the technology and the traditions in one place.
Right. And earlier you mentioned in doing social enterprise or social works or social cultural studies, they are usually not driven by commercial values. So meaning they are not a big development. They are not chasing after the rich people for the certain things, right? And then usually these events or workshops, they are supported by local authorities or governments, right? How usually, and apart from that, that's where the private sector will comes in and to support, if they to donate or to make things feasible. So most of them, I'm curious, like where do the funds come in to support these events? Does UNESCO also part of it to be to finance the events or workshops?
UNESCO doesn't have any money. UNESCO is not a funding body at all, because it receives money from governments to implement specific things. So the money always comes from outside. It can come from national governments, to organize a specific activity or produce a specific thing, or it can come from corporations. So they are, in the case of Japan, like Japan has, Japan's corporate culture is quite inclined to give money to culture.
Right.
I mean, it's, a lot of cultural things in Japan are financed by, whether they are fashion companies or, electronic companies, whatever, like they give a lot of money to cultural activities. So, and it's, in fact, in Japan, like museums and these type of places are funded. It's a bit like in America, it's privately funded in a lot of cases. And you also have these big, you probably know Mori Museum in Tokyo is the Mori, Mr. Mori is a big, real estate person, a billionaire. So, it's like each country has different way of financing, but in the case of Japan, I would say the money is usually private money. And that's where the cultural economy in Japan is very, in a way, quite wealthy, because it's coming from the corporate. In Europe, for example, it's quite different, because a lot of funds are state funds for culture, and museums are like national
Right.
institutions.
Yeah.
So it's, and in Asia, it's a bit of a mix, but I do think that in Asia or Southeast Asia, there are a lot of private museums now. I think of, like, in Thailand, there have been more recently, private contemporary museums, and the money comes from individual people or companies, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
But I wonder, like, countries like Myanmar, or I'm not sure about Thailand, let's say Vietnam or Cambodia, the amount of their allocation of the fund. I just wanted to put it in a practical side. This does the importance of, of course, in a direct way, it does influence or affect the growth of a certain cultural aspect or the cultural quote unquote development. But in Japan, you were saying that most of them are actually supported by the private corporates. Do you think that will actually affect the direction or trajectory of a certain organization or even individuals like yourself to change based on their flavor?
No, from my experience, the corporations are quite open-minded. So they let the creativity side flourish. It works I find that in Japan it works. There isn't that sort of the corporation trying to control it or try to control the outcome. But in fact, it's the other way around. It's like when governments do things, like the Japanese government, when it tries to promote Japanese culture overseas and that sort of thing, they have a very specific way of doing it. So when the Japanese, let's say you have Japan Foundation or these kind of organizations that are more from the public sector, they're more controlling of what they want to have promoted overseas, or how they want to show their culture to the outside world. And I think in most governments it's like that. In Malaysia, I know that, having worked some sense with the government, I think there is a specific idea of what the government wants to present, right? It's very political, especially in a place like Malaysia, because you have cultural diversity within your country, right?
Yeah.
You have many different minorities, and you have a majority. It becomes very political in Malaysia always, because what do you want to promote as Malaysian culture? It's very
It's so hard to define as well.
sensitive. Yeah, and sensitive because you don't want to sometimes spell it out loud, depending on who you're talking with, because you know that certain people don't want to hear it, or they want to hear a certain story, a certain version of it. So that is the same in a lot of Southeast Asian countries, because there is always the ethnic majority, ethnic minorities, indigenous people, and so forth.
Right.
So when it becomes like that, there is always, like, who do you want to put first, or who do you want to highlight as the national? And when it becomes national identity, it's always problematic, no matter where. I really dislike this idea of national identity, because it's not real. It's a fiction. It's a fabrication, right?
Right.
But most people think in a simplistic way like that, like, oh, when you go to Malaysia, you get this, or when you go to Thailand, you get this. And it's in the end, you end up with a bunch of cliche cliche images that are not necessarily true.
Right.
That's why I think it's important to kind of show the different sides of the spectrum, or to show the full spectrum
Right.
to understand the country.
Right. There comes a wire for culture about Mark Pagel. He's a professor in anthropology, and he also saying a nationality is actually an illusion in a way to tells you once you cross this border, this is Thailand, this is Malaysia, kind of thing, And then once you speak Malay, means you are from Indonesia or Malaysia, you are not from Singapore, kind of thing, So
Yeah,
there
yeah.
is illusion or mindset or limitations, to control yourself, saying that, oh, you are French, you can't do this, you can't do that. But in fact, you yourself being a global citizen, you wants to be as open as you want. And I wonder, how do you see yourself when you approach the local communities, like especially in rural areas, they might not be exposed to so much things, They might see like, oh, okay, there is English people comes into my village. What are they going to do, kind of thing. So are you
Well, I must
usually
say, no, but in my case, I mean, if I'm just me without the Europeans around me, actually, when it's just me, people actually never feel threatened, because actually, I no matter where I go, I actually could look like any person from that place. And that's something that's recently someone told me, like, oh, I could be like an ethnic minority in Myanmar, or I could be an ethnic minority in Thailand. Or in Thailand, people say, oh, you're a Chinese Thai, like because I have a fair skin. And so in a funny way, actually, my appearance has really been helpful, because I have the appearance of someone who could be from anywhere. I could fit in many different in Asia, of course, not here in Europe. So when I go to the village or something and people see me, actually they don't really feel like, oh, there is a foreigner coming in, and oh, who is this person? I I actually have been helped by my Asian appearance, that is the undefined Asian appearance, that I could be from any country in Asia. And not people never think, oh, she's from Japan. Like there isn't that sort of. If I'm in Japan, of course, people in Japan know that I'm from Japan. Like they know, from my appearance. But if I'm in Thailand, a lot of Thai people think I'm from Thailand. It's very funny like that, you know. In
That's very
Malaysia,
helpful.
in Malaysia, I don't know. Maybe I don't really look. But some Singaporeans said, "Oh, you look like Singaporean." And and I think I don't really look Singaporean, but I don't know.
I think that's a very interesting point as well. I mean, it's not. I hope this is not. We are not inclined this discussion to so-called racism or things. This is much more like genetic appearance. I would say it is totally out of our control, isn't it?
It is, but it's a reality. It's actually the way you look is really play. No matter, you can say, oh, racism, discrimination, but in the end, your face is your face. Like you cannot fake it. So if you're in Europe and you're Asian person, when I'm in Paris, and I've been in Paris for almost my whole life, except for the travels and stuff, people think I'm a tourist. It doesn't matter, like, because my face is like, I'm an Asian person, so maybe they think they say ni hao or like whatever,
Right.
And in a funny way, I am more foreign when I'm in Paris than if I'm in a village in the middle of Myanmar. I mean, I feel more foreign to the locals in Paris than I feel, than for the people that I meet, let's say in a kampong or in a village or whatever, and that's the funny thing about the way you look, is that no matter how hard you try, you will never go beyond the physical appearance. You cannot fake that part.
But does it help if, let's say, you can speak a very fluent French, then it will change their perception? It says, wow, I'm so surprised actually you've been growing up in France for a while.
Yeah, of course, because actually I have a French passport now. So when I travel, I go with my French passport. And one time I remember I was in Indonesia and I was going through customs, and the guy looked at my passport and he was looking at my face like, it's not possible, like you cannot be a French citizen. And he was trying to figure out, like what's going on here. He was really surprised. And it's funny, like this kind of perception of the face that you see, the nationality that you see. And even if today the world is so international or whatever,
Yeah.
globalized, but
Yeah.
still like there are some local tendencies of, you look a certain way, people see you a certain way. If
Yeah.
you're from such place, you should behave in a certain way. If you're Asian, you're probably very, quiet and,
Yeah. Yeah.
disciplined, and
Yeah.
you never make any trouble. So that's always the confusion about me, because people probably think I'm quite shy or quiet, and then I speak out and say all kinds of stuff, and they're like, "Oh, this is not a Japanese person."
I think that's very interesting as well. You know how personality somehow being quote unquote stereotype into a certain culture.
Yeah.
In speaking of that, when I was looking up to your works, there is this, I won't say struggle, but the interplay of globalized and localized, because I think, like you said, in nowadays was with the internet, especially, things appears to be so accessible and global in a way. And then, but I see the benefit of being local is that you understand your own roots. And also, I always think that if, let's say, if you are not the one who write it, who's gonna write this? Um, Bruno Latour, I hope
Mm.
I will pronounce his name right. He's saying that two extremes called local and global are much less interesting than intermediary arrangement called network. And this network is usually very ambiguous. It allows you to go anywhere because it's an open network. Um, and also popular culture by John Story, he's saying that always define implicit and explicitly, in contrast to other conceptual categories like folk culture, which is, I think, very close to your heart in a way, because you have been mentioned Mingge quite a while in some of the writings. So how do you approach to, let's say, a kampong, and then you wanted to globalize it in a way you don't want it to disappear, right? You want it to be documented or recorded, but at the same time to preserve and not to alter too much of it.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I don't really have like a goal for the people who are from a specific place.
Mm,
My intention is more to inspire people to do that for themselves. I don't really, I don't see my role to be, okay, you have to do this like in
right, right.
this way. My role is more to inspire people to value what they have, to understand why what they have is valuable. If they have a specific uh, skill, a unique way of making something, of
Mm,
living, of thinking about the world. I'm more interested in how the people themselves are the protectors or the guardians of their own culture. My role is not to say this is how you should be doing something.
right.
It's more about showing that because I appreciate your culture, you should feel inclined to extend it further because other people appreciate it. You know, the interest in the culture is not just because it has to be preserved, but it's because maybe it has a meaningful dimension to other people.
Mm,
Some cultures, of course, are not universal. There are cultures that can be appreciated by a lot of people, and it becomes, it can explode globally because the culture itself has meaning in different contexts. But some cultures are only meaningful for a very small group. That doesn't mean that the culture is less important, but the meaning can only be appreciated by a small number because it only speaks to a certain number of people.
mm,
Uh, but I think in my case, it's more about inspiring people to understand what they have, to appreciate what they have, and not always think that what is coming from outside is better, because that's something that always encountered in Southeast Asia, that what is foreign is superior. I mean, that is the kind of remnants of the colonized or the era when, I mean, many countries have been told that their country, maybe their culture was inferior or less valuable, and there is a narrative. There has always been a narrative of
mm,
you know what is high and what is low,
mm,
but actually there isn't such a thing. Such a thing does not exist. It's only been staged. It's
mm,
been staged through narratives, through institutions, and of course the Western world has been very good at it, by saying, our culture is far superior to, I mean, that was in the old days, obviously. But there is a sort of legacy or some kind of remnant of that mindset, which I really feel is sometimes lives within the communities. The communities themselves believe that they're inferior and therefore they don't cherish what they have. And that's,
Mm.
I find it really, there is a sad truth, because if they feel that way, they will never think of preserving or, protecting what they have locally.
Yeah.
And they always feel like, oh, what is outside is more appealing, more
Right.
developed, and it's something difficult to reverse.
For yourself, because you have been seeing the how the global culture been going on, that's why you feel much more appreciative to those local culture and also the so-called hidden perspective, right? um but for those people who are living in the rural areas, they might not be exposed so much of these things, and then they might not feel appreciated because they feels like, this thing doesn't make money kind of thing. But
Yeah.
there are lots of things more than just money. Um and it reminds me of In Praise of Shadow. He was talking about, to understand a shadow, you have to put some light to appreciate more kind of thing. This kind of contrast between darkness and brightness to allows you to be appreciated with darkness. In fact, darkness or shadow is actually something very, very beautiful as well.
Mm.
So, but when we apply this to local knowledge, how do, in what sense to make them feel confident or appreciate their own knowledge, by I'm not sure how helpful the publications or documentations to help them to, to be more appreciative and also
Yeah, I don't think it's like, I mean, it's not, documentation and this kind of like very academic or the written text, doesn't really speak to a lot of the people from, coming from the villages, and because they don't have that sort of written culture anyway.
right,
A
right.
lot of times they have but I must say, I mean, this photo that you're showing, that, I'm riding a motorcycle with this guy. He actually, he's a young ethnic minority in Laos, and he's very proud of his culture. I mean, he's definitely, I mean, very from a very humble background, farming and trying to get by, trying to make a living, living on this kind of piece of land in the middle of the countryside. And it's interesting because he really wants to preserve. He's only like not even 30, but he really wants to preserve, like, his indigenous culture and show it to people. And but of course it's like, he needs the support to do that. He
Yeah,
cannot do
yeah.
it by himself. But I took him and a group of his, the people, his community. I took them to Bali in, I think, about 2 or 3 years ago, to an indigenous peoples festival. And, they had never been to Indonesia, so it was like a big deal for them. And one guy, I mean, had never been outside of Laos, had never been on a plane, so he lands in Bali, and there are all these other indigenous people from all over Asia. And for them, they were so proud, they're like, we're part of this event. And they
Right,
were like
right.
showcasing, they did like a performance, they did a dance performance and all that. And I could see that they were really proud of who they were, even if, their culture is not necessarily known to anyone out there. I mean, it's a really, really like obscure kind of, but they were really proud of it. And after the festival, they decided to organize their own festival back in the village,
Right, right.
and they're like, we're going to do the same thing. And they kind of made this like copycat event at their own scale, but it was really cute, like, I really felt like, oh, that's all it takes. Like, you just kind of encourage someone, and that small gesture can turn into something else. And it's, you just have to say, oh, what you have is really interesting, and people can feel encouraged, and they do it. Of course, it's hard to have that taking place every year, and that it continues, obviously, because they have a challenging life. But I feel like still you need to give that encouragement, or that's how I feel like what I can do at my own level,
Right.
to encourage. and to inspire ideas and say, oh, you could do that. You can do that in your village. Why don't you do a festival?
Right.
And they had tons of people.
I I see there are two levels to do this. Again, is an analogy of black and white. So one is that to encourage them to do another level up. So meaning to bring them to festival, to expose them to different kind of people, to meet people like yourself. And another way is to allows them to see, what's happened if let's say this culture disappear, you won't get that back anymore. So that kind of it's one is much more encouragement to push them. One is using the fear to push them. I'm not saying the fear is a bad thing, but it's rather to let them allow, this culture, it will not appear in anywhere else. It's only appear in your kampong or things.
Yeah. It's a risk. I mean, it's the taking the risk and jumping into something that is maybe unknown, but can create a lot of excitement. I mean, after you've done it, you feel like, oh, you've accomplished something. And I think that, a lot of people hesitate, like, should I do this? Oh, how do I get started? And some people, during the same time, I made a lecture to other Indonesian people, and some people were like, can you tell us how we could, showcase our culture? How can you tell us how to do this or that? And I said, well, you also have to find your own way of doing it. But they said, we don't know how to start. So you have to guide, I mean, at least show us the first step, kind of thing.
Right.
And it was quite overwhelming because all of them were a bit desperate, like, oh, tell us, like, and I was like, I have to go to your village. I mean, I don't know what you are about, like, but it was clear that there was such a eagerness to, especially among the young people, to display their local culture. And, I was really surprised that they were so much into it. And they really wanted to make either a business out of it or like try to find, like social enterprise or NGO or whatever. And there seems to be, and I think in Malaysia, you probably have that same potential where, people have something, but they don't know how to start to expand on that thing. Yeah.
Okay. I think in your role, you are not trying to change too much as well. I think I think there is this article or this event called Craft Forward, is it? It's called Crafted or something. Crafted 2.0.
Craft Forward. Yeah, I had two conferences, one Craft Forward and one called Craft Reveals.
Right.
There were two separate conferences, one in Myanmar
Right.
and one in Chiang Mai.
Right. So I think it's the Chiang Mai one, and then there are participants were asking, if let's say, I mean, at some point the economy needs to be pushing these cultural activities, but not too much, or else it will be very commercial.
Yeah.
And you did mention in the writing is a book by Arturo Escobar talking about this kind of autonomous design, where your role is what designing is just a framework, but what's feeling inside is by the local communities. They're gonna do it by themselves because you can't be there all the time. So I wonder this kind of framework, like you said, you have done some workshops and also events or festival or curations. They are usually maybe like 1 or 2 months maybe, and then the publication, let's say like Korea one is there so that you can visit most of the time. Once you get the book, you can visit it anytime. But how do you see this kind of temporal value to play in festival, in a way you don't want it to be like a one time thing? You want them to keep on doing it, but the festival is just part of the inspiration to to spark their motivation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about events, it happens and then it's finished and then people go back home and, and you want to keep the momentum, but then it's up to the people to continue or not. I cannot just like always be behind them and saying, okay, what are you doing now?
Yeah.
Like a school teacher with a stick. I mean, and it's not my role to do that. So I think that, the people have to find their own desire to, to continue the passion to do things. I'm just there to like initiate a spark or, sort of give an idea that, oh, maybe I could do that, or, oh, this sounds interesting. I want to try it in my, in my town or my village. So it's more like what I give is more like a starting point
Yeah.
to think about something maybe in a different way, to kind of give a different angle. The
Right.
publication, what I, when I do writing and I publish, um, that's maybe like more like a, not really a guidebook, because
Mm.
it's not like I'm giving specific tools. But I thought about in the past of publishing something that's more of a practical guide,
Mm.
where people can refer to a sort of flexible template on how to manage a project, a project that is related to culture and these sort of, topics, um, and how they can kind of, be guided by the different chapters on how to achieve something. So I thought
Mm.
about that sort of educational publication as well, so that it's
Right.
more practical. I don't know what you think. If it's
Mm.
something that people would actually want to use, but I thought about it in the past because I often meet people who ask me for advice, or like who want to know how to do something, but I want to show a template that is flexible enough so that they can do it their own way. So that's the
Mm.
difficulty. You don't want to
Mm.
be too technical. You want to give enough freedom so that they shape it their own way.
Yeah, but at the same time, you wanted to give a certain control as well, because or else it's gonna goes anywhere, and then it will goes back to the same, isn't it?
Well, it's just, yeah, you want to keep it within a frame so that there is an effectiveness to the methodology or the process. So it's maybe more like a random, like different processes that you can go through, just like design thinking or whatever it is.
Mm.
And then people can pick and choose the different processes and combine different ways to achieve what they want to achieve. But this is just an idea, like I'm just talking out loud.
Mm, mm, mm.
I'm just saying that it seems like a lot of people they want something quite precise rather than abstract, because when you go abstract, people are like, oh, this is confusing, I
Right,
don't know what
right,
you're
right,
talking about. So it depends on your audience too.
right. Because I think, in speaking of abstract, there is a very small group of consumer, I would say, because it's not everyone able to see that, as what you are saying. Even those, speaking of abstract art, it could be so much things of so much ways of interpretation. um and the next, because you have been talking about everydayness, and I thought it's very interesting, because I was talking to Nasmi, one of the lecturer in an architecture school, and he was talking about this kind of mundane life. He even called his collective or studio normal architecture. He don't wish to be, the
Mm.
provoking one. And I thought, but the thing is that I often compare someone's house and museum. They are sort of selective, and they go through a process of filter. They know which product, quote unquote, or certain artifacts, to showcase, so that can draw visitors and whatnot. But for a house, it's a collective thing. One day you see a painting and you like it, then you bring it home. um as yourself, like a curator, how do you filter, or perhaps you don't, because I'm kind of surprised that you quoted Soetsu Yanagi's works in your writing as well. And he also always says Fox art should be, go through a certain awareness. You don't want to be like a junk space, you collect too much things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's, I think it depends on, I mean, personal collection versus, I mean, depends which kind of context you're talking about. You're asking about me personally, how I collect objects, or is it more in general when I select contents for the purpose of a project, or is it more like a general question?
Well, I'm more curious. Let's say when you go to a place, let's say you wanted to do a workshop. Before that, you must have done some site visit. You have
Mm,
walked through, and then in the end, I'm not sure the brief given of that particular workshop, is it given by the local communities, or after that you found out that, okay, maybe we can do, let's say, textile, and then let's focus on textile.
mm,
But of course, even though that whole kampong, they might be doing potteries, they might doing some writings, there might be a certain languages, but what stands out for you to do as, let's say textile is the most prominent one, we should do that instead of do it as a whole, then it will be quite hard to capture it.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, it's, you know, usually if there is a selection, if there has to be a selection, it's it does come down to the, you know, the originality and the quality of the work that is produced there. You know, I mean, I usually try to find the uniqueness. If I see something that appears in a lot of different places, or that looks like it, you know, has been badly influenced by, let's say, a, you know, commercial trend or some kind of tourist trend that you see like all over the world, I would usually not go for that sort of, you know, product or you know, art. I usually try to find something that's very unique that I haven't seen elsewhere.
Right.
But at the same time, you know, there have been cases where, because at the end of the day, it's all about taste, you know, what you like may be totally different from what other people, you know, like in their town. And so there have been cases where the choice is left to the participants. Like, I don't make a choice at all,
Right,
and
right.
it's just up to them. Sometimes there will be things that I personally don't like, but you know, then you can say it's a matter of taste, and maybe what I like doesn't have any relevance to that actual context, because it can be that what I like is something that would never sell in the local context because they have a different taste, you see. And there are things, sometimes I go to a market and I think, wow, that looks really horrible, because maybe they've destroyed it through modernization or, you know, what else. And I sometimes feel like, oh, this is just like the ugliest stuff I've ever seen, but it's like the best-selling product.
So
So,
it
you
is
know,
it is beautiful because it is ugly.
then you have to think about, it goes back to this whole idea of making a livelihood. You know, what sells? If people are just making something because they have to sell it, and of course it could be something really ugly, but it sells like hotcakes because the tourists love it.
Right,
and
right, right.
and you know, and maybe I think it's totally like, you know, the most horrible stuff I've ever seen. But what can I say? I'm not going to say stop producing that, because otherwise what, they don't make money out of it,
Right,
right?
right.
So there is always that sort of, I think, your personal opinion of something and the actual, you know, situation that you're faced with. And sometimes you cannot, there is no you know, it's not your role to say, no, you shouldn't be selling that because it's ugly, or because it's like really a horrible piece of work.
Right, right.
You know, if it works for them as a product, as a, you know, something that they put out there on the market, then you know, it's up to the people to choose, you know, what they want to sell. But obviously it's not necessarily the best stuff. And that's where I think where we are at now in the world, is that, you know, maybe there used to be products that were much more interesting 20 years ago, and today they've become, you know, generic factory type of things. But that's the battle that we're, you know. But even then, I think you always have to try to find the beauty within that sort of ugliness. I think, like what you said, without dark and light or whatever, you
Right,
know,
right, right.
there is. I actually sometimes like that junk type of stuff too. I like popular culture, and I like places like Las Vegas type of, you know. I mean, maybe you'll find that's a contradiction with what I'm doing, but I do also like the tacky. Sometimes I enjoy tackiness. Like
I think
there is
it's
a
very
side of
important.
me,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I think it's very important.
You
So
know, and also in the book spaces, I put this fake Louis Vuitton, sort of weird, you know,
right,
cotton dress or something.
right,
It's a fake in Thailand, but I kind of enjoy that sort of bizarreness. You know, like how, you know, the Chanel, like this is a Chanel, fake Chanel
right.
at the market. I'm quite fascinated by that sort of tackiness too. You know,
Yeah, and
it's part of the world.
and because we are now talking about this kind of identity, local identity. How does it Is it possible to manifest it from a different kind of point of view? And I thought this particular chapter you did mention is a urban kitchen. So it's an international workshop. So
Mm-hmm.
I remember this picture very well. It's a horse statue, but then the participants, they interpreted in different kind of ways, you know but by using local materials. That's very important. And then let's say the key thing is that you must use local materials, but it doesn't really matter what kind of form, but as long as you're using the local materials to approach to people. And it reminds me of the David Ajay's writing. He was talking about, if let's say I wanted to design a new form, then I must use the same materials. But
Mm-hmm.
if I wanted to use the different materials, then I must use the same form. Let's say, I don't know, kampong in a in a different kind of materials. But
Yeah.
I would like to ask, like, what is the key principle where you differentiate between the everydayness and also the ubiquitousness? In a way, you don't want it to be like globalized kind of thing. It appears everywhere. It becomes like in our everyday. But at the same time, there is a certain danger that once a certain practice or product has been used so frequent, it becomes part of our lifestyle that we never practiced before. For example, like iPhone, it's never been a thing, but then it somehow becomes a need for most of us. But I wonder, how does it happen in, let's say, rural areas? They 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 don't they don't practice a certain things. Maybe it's a climate change as well, like certain agricultural practice is it's not possible anymore because the time is changing. And we no longer able to practice that. And in that sense, how do we protect or preserve that culture, apart from
Mm.
documentation?
But
It must be hard. Yeah.
mm, I think that even with the new technology, there is always a local way of using the technology or the new things. If you think of, the mobile, I mean, the smartphone and how it's used, let's say, in one country versus another country, the kind of social media and how social media content differs from one place to another. In a way, like there are so many, we use the similar platforms and tools, but there is always a local way of you know
Perception, isn't it?
not only perception, but I think that of generating that content. Even if you think of a selfie, let's say a Thai girl taking a selfie versus a Thai girl in Bangkok takes a selfie, posts it on Instagram, and then you'll have a girl in a village in Myanmar. She'll post a selfie on her Instagram, but you'll see that they are like different. I mean, maybe sometimes they're totally similar, but sometimes they are very different because
Mm,
they'll be
mm,
wearing their very different clothes, they
mm.
have very different makeup or different, and I think that there is an expression, there is a variety of expression even within
Mm,
something that is so generic as the selfie, that is like you know a lot of people are doing all over the world, but
right.
they want to find their own way of doing it, or they have their own kind of way of appropriating the actual the
Right.
actual activity. And I think that in a way, like even if everything is globalized and more similar, the local expressions and the local take on something always survives. Like
Right.
it's like even if you, I mean, I was thinking of McDonald's. McDonald's has different menu in each country. Or like,
Yeah.
in France, the McDonald's has like with French bread. There is a
Mm,
specific burger here, where the bread is actually like a real French, crafted. and 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 when you think of, I mean, that's like an extreme example, but in a way, all the global things have local variations.
right.
And so the what is local, I mean, there's so many ways of defining what
Yeah.
local means,
Yeah.
whether it's something really grassroots that is hard core kampong
Mm, mm,
lifestyle,
mm.
or whether it's in a big city. I think of like big mega cities in Asia where there are so many subcultures.
Right.
You have subcultures. I
Right.
mean, just think of like Chinese culture and the subculture. I mean, it's like out of control. So in that sense, you can define local in so many, there are so many layers of local, from
Right.
local, super local to the globalized local or the localized global.
So it's I wonder how many levels would you range there? Is it 5 level like
I don't
0,
know, but I
+1,
think
and +2?
it, no, it could be +10. I think it would be an interesting study.
Right.
I can't remember, there was like some study about, in fact, globalization has not been studied enough from local perspective. Like
Right.
globalization is always seen as this big one thing, as in like a big, kind of unity of something. But it's actually, globalization is like made of many different pieces,
Right. Right. Right.
from local places.
Right.
And this guy, I can't remember who it was, but he writes that because there isn't enough study at the local level of how globalization is taking place, we have a very little understanding of what globalization is, because we always think of it as this big thing, very big abstract thing without any shape. But if you look at the very local shapes, you realize that actually there are so many facets of
Yeah.
globalization,
Yeah.
and it's a fascinating thing to probably that to do a study of globalization in different areas, and to kind of put this piece, the puzzle together, try to understand
Right.
how it looks like.
But I often see it as a process, because when you're talking about, let's say, global brand, like let's say global franchise like KFC, for example, but it was local in a way, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
It was local back then, but it grows bigger, and then
It's like, yeah, every I mean, there's Starbucks coffee from Seattle, and they have their
yeah,
original store there, like as
yeah,
if there's some kind of, no, it's everything started small and expanded, and became so it's true. But in terms of American corporate, that sort of KFC, McDonald's type of brand, I think it's very also specific to American, that sort of American corporate
right,
culture, which is a culture of its own. And it hasn't really been, maybe China is going to create, or is creating a similar wave, in terms
mm,
of global expansion.
mm,
But I cannot think of, even like Japanese brands that are quite big are never as big as like stuff that's the US has produced so far in terms of
right,
influence.
right, right. You did mention just now, Instagram is a rather, even though it's a global platform, but it's quite open, and it reminds me of this particular chapter. Vasa, is it? I think her name is Vasa. So she's based in Laos, and then her
Mm.
way of wearing the
Yeah,
Hmong dress.
yeah,
So that's
yeah.
very interesting one. And then even though it's using, I don't know, at some point there is a certain sarcastic. I mean, it's not the sarcastic in a way to tease, but in a sarcastic to create this kind of contrast using global platform or social media to express the traditional outfit, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that elevates to another level. But I'm not sure. What do you think? Do you see the pendulum in a way? Because you were saying social enterprise or cultural study is in minority in a way back then, but now it swings back to globalize in a major movement. So do you see it is moving in that direction? Like, we are more aware of local culture, we are more aware of vernacular things, we are more aware of local materials. I think there is a certain movement in
Mm.
architecture, but I'm not sure in art.
Yeah, I think there is more and more. In the last, if I think of the last 10 years, I think there's been an expansion of also a trend in things that are handmade, things that are local. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a trend. So I think that more people, especially people from creative sectors, started to focus on those kind of topics. I don't know if it's changed anything for the actual communities or the people who produce,
Mm.
stuff, but there has been a growth, in a way, a growth of, social entrepreneurs who work with local producers of textiles or that kind of stuff. I've seen that. But
Mm.
it's in a way, the actual social kind of pattern hasn't changed, because a lot of the poorer people always depend on the wealthier urban, people, or like they kind of, they
Mm.
to sell their product, they always have to depend on the people who have more influence or
Right,
money.
right.
So in an economic sense, I'm not sure how much has changed, because I still see the hierarchy between rich and poor, or the privileged people versus the unprivileged people. And in the case of tourism, I think before the COVID-19, I think a
Mm.
lot of people depended on tourists, the tourism industry to sell stuff or to live from these kind of locally produced goods. And now
Mm.
that the COVID is here and like everybody's like, stop traveling,
Right.
uh, I know that a lot of people have no income to, they have to go back to farming or like do stuff differently. So in a way, like their autonomy, to go back to that topic of autonomy, is that economically it's very hard for people to be autonomous if they
Mm.
depend on a market that is
Yeah.
foreign, or um, so that's I think that's a big challenge in
Yeah. I often see there is always this boils down to this option called tourism. It seems to be like I don't know. This is how I feel. Is like when we in architecture school, it tends to be like if you don't have anything else to think about, let's plug in the so-called co-working space, or it boils to this very common program that we wanted to insert. And then when we're talking about culture wise, tourism, it seems to be like the final outcome. You can't seems to be paired up with other things else. It's like if you wanted to talk about a certain heritage, then you must link it to tourism, but it seems to be leave no space for the local culture to grow in another sector.
yeah,
Or
yeah,
may it be industrial. I mean industry is opens another opportunity where you talks about, let's say, organic farming, and then it must open not limited to tourism but
mm,
open to more market in a way.
yeah, yeah. I think, I mean, tourism is always, is has this kind of negative, like you cannot embrace it fully, because you always have this kind of negative side of it. It's like it has positive things about it, but it's also like can be destructive.
Hmm.
um, so yeah, I think, and this whole like associating heritage with tourism all the time,
Yeah.
of course, is like, it makes heritage lose its integrity in a way. But having said that, I think some countries, I mean, I come from both, Japan and France are countries that have succeeded with uh, linking their heritage to tourism. Actually, those are the two countries maybe that have done it in the most. Um, they have been able to stage their culture in such a way that many people became attracted to it and want to travel to their country.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, if you do it well, you don't have to do it in a cheesy or tacky way necessarily. I think there are ways of doing tourism in with taste,
Right.
with
Right.
and it doesn't have to be like all like the bad tourism that you kind of cringe about, like, oh, this is horrible. It
Right.
doesn't have to be necessarily like that. And there is a kind of tourism now which, but I don't want to advocate for like these kind of luxury things, because I don't really believe in the these kind of luxurious products. I mean, I'm not
Hmm.
someone who is fond of that kind of thing. But the tourism, there is a sort of tourism now that is exclusive and is all about finding the most unique stuff, experiencing the most unique, places,
Hmm.
food, craft, whatever
Right.
you and but the problem is always that exclusivity, luxury, always becomes the last kind of frontier. Like it's always that area that preserves the quality, or like, that's where the quality belongs.
Right.
Which means that in the end, what? So other people can only have the bad quality stuff. Is that what it means? So I think we have to think again about who has access to what, and whether culture is something for the elite. That's always a
Mm,
big question.
mm, mm.
Um, and you mentioned museums and all of that. I think places with culture is for a certain crowd, and
Right.
unfortunately, it's still like, I think access to culture is still reserved for certain people of certain backgrounds. I
Mm,
find that
mm,
unfortunate.
mm. Clarissa was saying, I like ministry in Malaysia is a Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture is quite interesting to, I wouldn't say it's a bad idea, but I just think that it's very interesting that it just sort of combined together. And I always thought tourism, they works very close with finance part. They wanted to earn money from that. But then while the culture and art, they are trying to stay away from that. But at the same time, they wanted to promote and propagate the local culture and also the identity. So before we move on to medium and communication, that's probably the last part of today's conversation. I'm not sure what do you guys think. If you guys have any thought, feel free to share. We will go through later, or maybe if let's say there's now, then we'll open the floor for it. And speaking of medium and communication, it's much more on the approach, on the how factor, because we have been talking about the why factor and the motivation that you are doing so far. In speaking of communicative tool, the language is the key thing in the way. How do you talk to the indigenous people, for example, or local community? Do you usually accompany with a translator, or because you come?
Mm.
I'm not sure. Perhaps you know how to speak some Thai or Vietnamese to talk with the
I can
people.
pretend to speak some Thai, but it doesn't last for a long time. No, it depends, but sometimes I have a professional, like, some people who are part of a professional team with me, but sometimes it's just like a friend or someone that I know that comes with me to do the translation. And yeah, for the Korean project, I had this recruit is a big word, but I had this young student who was bored during the summer, and he said, okay, I can help you out, and I paid him a little bit
Right.
to be my translator on the trip. So yeah, it depends. It can be very informal or it can be very organized, depends on the organization and the context of the project.
But in speaking of come back to this global thing, and then English seems to be a global language, right? I wonder in rural areas, do they speak English?
Sometimes there are some people who can communicate in English, but it's quite rare.
Right,
And
right,
so in most cases, the people, like to speak in their own language. They feel more comfortable.
right, right. So I think that's also because back then I was doing some workshop, and it's very important to have these people called the community leader. That's the bridge, because if you wanted to talk with a community, you can't speak to them directly. So you might want to find the chief, the
Mhm.
village chief to talk about it, and then he or she will usually very helpful, to help you to talk to and find a certain people to talk to, and then they might know a certain network or channel, to that particular community. But in speaking of publication, which is usually the end result or the approach, the platform to share about a certain knowledge, and then your books are usually in English or French or Japanese. How would you like to talk about this kind of translation or idea so that it's not too far-fetched? I mean, it's not just about the practice, but also about language. I think you yourself also know Wabi Sabi is not able to exactly translate in English in a way, because
Mhm.
they have a certain context, or even Iki that you mentioned quite a few times.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's part of the. I think it's to have the misunderstanding is part of it's part of the publication. Sometimes
Right, right.
people will maybe misunderstand certain things, or maybe I cannot explain everything in English, but I can only sort of give a feeling of it. So I'm not too concerned about the possibility that something is misunderstood, because
Mm.
actually sometimes you speak the same language and you totally misunderstand each other. You know?
Yes.
It's part of human communication that you can be around the table speaking English all together, and actually you totally get different ideas. So I don't worry too much about that sort of even if of course access to anything depends on the language that the person can
Mm.
speak or read.
Mm.
But English is mainly my work is always in English.
Right.
I don't write so much. I don't write in French so much, and Japanese, as I said, I don't really have. I'm a half illiterate in Japanese because I never
Mm.
went to school there.
Mm.
So yeah, English is my first writing language now.
But I think at some point also English allows you to get to a bigger crowd, isn't it? To
Mm,
allows you to share the thoughts from
yeah.
different kind of the world in a very comfortable platform in a way. um, I would like to ask, like, because most of your works are conducted in rural areas. The most memorable one I can remember is Yilan in Taiwan. It's not that rural, but it's more
Mm,
of the suburban kind of thing.
yeah.
But then when I look at one particular project, it's called Cities Cross Design. It's much more in America, especially in big
Mm,
cities.
mm-hmm.
It's talk about entrepreneurs and also the small businesses. I
Yeah.
if no mistaken, I saw some like bicycle workshop
Yeah.
or some workshops in the across the cities in
Yeah. Yeah.
America. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wonder what are the differences between working in different kind of geographical contexts in this sense.
In the end, it's not that different. I mean, the way I
Mm,
approach it's all about meeting people and kind of trying to discover, you know, or learn about what they do. So I don't have a different approach. Back in those days, I mean, the Cities by Design project was, I was at the time I was more focused on this whole idea of creative cities. I was also part of the UNESCO Creative Cities project, and I was really looking at how urban areas can benefit from creativity.
mm,
So that was a time when I was much more in the urban context, and I think the rural context started more when I started to explore Southeast Asia, because I didn't really know about rural context that much before visiting the different countries in Southeast Asia. I realized that there's this whole other world that is kind of neglected.
mm,
And it's not just in Southeast Asia, it's actually all around the world. The rural areas have been sort of, abandoned in a lot of industrialized countries.
mm,
And it made me think about, oh, so, why this separation, urban, rural, how different is it, you know? And what's interesting is that today, and especially now with the coronavirus, a lot of
mm.
people move back to the countryside,
Yeah.
and people think about quality of life, space, what
Mm,
you get out of living in the countryside versus living in a big city.
mm,
So there's always this kind of, um, I guess, the contrast between the two, but also nowadays more urban people accepting the rural.
mm.
And I guess the rural people don't accept the urban as much, or they go to urban areas just to get jobs.
Right,
A
right,
lot of
right.
people like move to urban areas to find work, but it's not because they love to be in an urban area. It's just
Yeah,
pure necessity. But for urban people, it's more like, oh, I'd like to live in the countryside because I can have a better life.
yeah.
And I'm a bit of one of those people. I'm from an urban area. I grew up in cities. I'm not a countryside,
Mm,
person at first, but I think I started to understand, like, oh, this is what you get out of being in closer to nature, and having the sort of environment that you can never have in a city.
right. I think that's pretty much well illustrated in your book Hitokoto, because most of the photos and also the watercolors, they are inspired or in nature on landscape. That's why I think it's very interesting you did mention is the landscapes of the heart. So I believe heart in this context is your personal stories and how do you see Japan from your. I think it's a very distant because you have been living in France for quite a while, and then now you revisit Japan, and then especially looking at landscape, and then your watercolors sort of tells pretty obvious in that sense. And speaking of watercolors, I would like to ask, because most of your works, they are, one is there with handwriting, which I think is very attached to my heart, because simply talking about writings or typewriting, it seems to be a very global thing also. We can say Arial or Time News Roman, we know that. But then in speaking of handwriting, is a very unique way of your expression. And then second thing is about watercolor, and I always thought this very consistent is always, we are still talking about watercolors, but when you're talking about Tokyo plates or Kiarak or Two Seasons, politics of objects, they have different directions. So are they done on site? So you capture a certain color scheme that you saw, and then you translate it onto paper.
No, I don't really do anything on site.
Right.
I mean, I used to in the past, but nowadays I don't. I usually I work from memory, or sometimes I work from a photograph. But I usually, I don't do it on the spot. Although I might start again, because now I'm in the middle of nature, so I could, yeah.
Right.
But I don't really, I feel a bit self-conscious being out, let's say on the street, and like having people looking at me for painting or something. I don't feel so comfortable.
Right.
So I
Right.
need my space, and so I usually do it in my studio, and also the colors, I have a specific range of watercolors from Japan that I always use.
Oh, okay. Right.
So they have very beautiful colors actually. So they are, kind of a strong asset
Yeah.
in my ability to produce certain landscapes. They have really, really nice range of colors, and I
Yeah.
always use those to do my work.
Yeah, and usually they are quite light color and is much more on beige. And then even though there are some like strong like red color, but still
Mm-hmm.
the opacity is not as like solid red. I
Yeah.
think it's also part of the nature of watercolor. It's not as
Yeah.
strong as a canvas, like an oil painting kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
it's very watery. I mean, it works with layers, and you kind of like go on layer after layer of color. Yeah.
right. I think we almost come to the end, and I think there are a few questions laid outlined here,
Mm-hmm.
has been answered previously in some sharings. You did mention two key problems. So one is the superficial interpretation of culture asset, which I think is underdoing, which is below zero, is we don't understand enough. And then another level is associate culture with commodity centered development. So meaning it's not saying they know too much, it's rather they thought money can solve a lot of things. I mean, that's I think one of the ex-prime minister of Malaysia thinking cash is king kind of idea. Um, when it comes to this, I think instead of let's talk about what we should do, why don't we talk about what we shouldn't do? Because I think that's also supporting the commodity centered development, to allow this kind of people always thought, okay, money can solve a lot of things. In fact, it doesn't. So how do you see the balance? I think it's a big questions, but how do you see the balance between to financially feasible or certain things, but at the same time, you don't want it to be appear to be too commercialized or capitalist?
Yeah, well, I think that there will always be, super commercial things. I mean, that will always exist. So my feeling is that if there are, a small number of people who really believe in what they do and kind of believe in quality, rather than profit or just profit,
Right.
I think that if there are enough of those, people who really want to produce something meaningful, then that kind of thing will always have. I believe there will always be a market for that kind of product, because quality, is rare nowadays. There are very few things that are very good quality, very meaningful. At a low price is almost like, it's extremely rare now. But in a way, for me, Southeast Asia is fascinating because there are still so many amazing things at a very low price. And for
Yes.
me, that is really exceptional about the region, because you can find really beautiful things, and they are not expensive as they would be in Europe or, in Japan. So I think that it's not a matter of producing a lot of high quality things. It's about having enough of meaningful things that, people believe in. And obviously, if that stuff sells, it's better because it will sustain the production of it. But I think there are, quite a number of people who are working in that direction, who are really like, believe that they will make something, of high quality that has meaning, treating, the producers in a way that is respectful, that kind of stuff. I think there are an increasing number of people who are doing that, and on the other end, you will always have people who are just thinking about profiting and making stuff. But in the end, if you want to really make a lot of profits, it's better to make stuff in a factory. I mean, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the reality of it. It's like, why don't you just make thousands and thousands of stuff in an industrial way? If you want to make money, it's probably a better strategy, right? If you want to make high quality products on a mass scale, then you have to become like LVMH or those kind of European luxury companies, but they have so much power and influence that I think it's very hard to compete against those guys, because they
They
own
have
a
long
lot.
history as well.
They have a long history. They have a brand that is not just a shallow brand, because actually what they did, someone was saying like, oh, Chanel, like they just like sell their logo all around the world, like, and it's like has no meaning. But actually, no, there is meaning behind. I mean, not that I would defend it, as a luxury thing, but it's actually a brand that has a long history. So, the people buy into that as well. It's not just like a random thing that came up 5 years ago and now it's actually came from a long history, and it's also about a woman who, kind of like made her own empire. So there's a lot of, there is depth within that brand. Actually, it's not just a shallow brand. But some people tend to think, oh, it's just a logo,
Right.
and it's without realizing it took 100 years to achieve it. So I think that to make something really good, not only you have to like dedicate yourself, but you also have to be patient. I mean, you have to spend a lot of time pursuing it and kind of developing, pushing it. It doesn't happen in a year.
Right.
And
Yeah.
nowadays, I guess a lot of people are impatient. They just want to get things
Fast.
fast, because everything is fast. Everything is, immediate. But to develop something over 10, 20, 30 years sounds like, oh no, I don't want to do that, because it's, it feels like too much of a sacrifice. But in the end, the people who achieve something really good always spend a long time developing it, I believe. Yeah. So patience is key. And in Malaysia, probably also that's sort of patience to, to do something and to continue something without giving up, I would say.
Right. I think also the environment that pushes us, whether should we move fast or not. Because I can remember walking in Singapore, just simply talking about walking speed. Singapore is so fast. I mean, the escalator is way faster than KL, for example. I do have another question. I mean, maybe we will close up very soon. How do you see this kind of getting famous and between the value? Because people will usually often associate this thing like, okay, so you are rare, that's why you are expensive kind of thing. But like, let's say just talking about fashion, it's like H&M compare with Chanel, for example. But H&M is a rather, they are focused on the bigger crowd, and also they don't talk about luxurious brands. But once in a while, they will cross over with some famous designer. But when it comes to culture-wise, how do you see to I don't think the point here is to make certain things expensive, because I don't think that's the purpose you want, right? You don't want a certain batik or textile to be extremely expensive. Recently we came across this design mahjong set, or the design kebaya or design Malays traditional outfit. So how do you see? I think at some point you also not expect certain things will go beyond certain things to be famous, quote unquote.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the problem is that, quality is now associated with a price tag. So you
Right.
think that something that is expensive is, or many people think that because it's expensive, it's valuable, but it actually has no value whatsoever. So that's the problem, is this kind of, the price tag versus the actual real value and meaning of the object, or the commodity. Uh, in the end, that's kind of, I mean, it's a difficult question, because there is no, people will believe what they want to believe in.
Yeah.
But what you're saying about the fact that certain things should be kept outside of that circle, or outside of the marketplace or the luxury marketplace, for their authenticity. I think that, yeah, I mean, if that product can survive within a local context without costing a lot, it's a very valuable thing, because it's a relevant product for the community. It has its history, it has its symbolic meaning, whatever it is. And I think that sort of product is much more touching than something that's in a luxury mall
Right.
somewhere that costs thousands and actually has a very shallow, doesn't have much substance. So it goes back to the idea of Minge. I mean, Minge was about that. It's about things that are exceptional but are very cheap, that have no, I mean, they don't have an inexpensive price, but they're extremely valuable.
Yeah.
They're very perfect, So it's all about what we perceive as something important, what we cherish more. Is it the LV bag because, oh, it's, so expensive, and but then again, everybody can get it in any airport in the world. So it's like, why is that so valuable?
Yeah.
Versus something that you find in a village that is like a one-off piece, but it's, all crooked and maybe bizarre looking, but has
Yeah.
its own charm and it feels very special, and
Right.
it's very. So all of these value thing, commodity, it's a strange, it's a strange debate. I don't really have an answer as
Right.
to what's the solution for it. I think there will always be around the world different things,
Yeah.
and the importance is that we keep the variety of, the diversity of what's out there. That I find is most important, that we can go somewhere and see things from very different people, different objects, and so we're not condemned to like a very few brands or very few things that we all have the same. I mean, it's turning into that with shopping malls, because we all have the same brands now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But hopefully we can travel or go places and see something that is only exists in that one place. I
Right.
find that more exciting than having something that's very expensive.
Right. I do agree with the diversity part, because I think we have been so focused onto a certain things, and we have been figuring out or been invested so much our effort into thinking how to make things expensive. But why don't we talk about how to make things viable, and also make things democratic in a way to available for wider people, and also to collect more data and allows this option to be more wider, instead of talking about these certain things must be associated with a certain brand. why don't we can create more brands or
Mm.
more understanding of a certain object, to associate with the this kind of again, it boils down to this diversity. I would say I always wanted to explore this kind of wider range. um you did mention Mingay, and I thought Soetsu, the beauty of everyday things is a good example, and talking about this kind of folk art. And the first few chapters he has been talking about folk art is when you're doing it without consciousness, because they don't want to get famous in a
Mm.
way, because they
Yeah.
just doing for serving the people. I think that's also the key point, because that's the problem. That's the thing, that's why they don't hike up the price, because they want people to enjoy a affordable but good quality things. So, but
Mm.
in the end, so Esu comes out this the piece, the resistance is that he created this folk art museum. He to showcase another side of museum. So I wonder, what is your next step? Do you wanted to have a museum as well?
I wouldn't mind having a museum, but I guess that would be quite a, I would need quite a lot of support. Actually, I was quite interested in, because I was talking about earlier about, how to advise people, or, kind of give people some framework or
Hmm.
advice. I've been quite interested in developing some form of like informal education kind of program. I mean, that is a big, ambition of mine, which I don't know if will ever be realized, but I'm quite interested in kind of creating a sort of informal education, a sort of lab where people could come and experiment different ideas, do workshops, um,
Hmm.
and yeah, sort of come together and think about ideas together. So it's a bit like a residency type of place, but
Hmm.
also a place where people can, meet and exchange ideas, and also like, learn about different processes, different ways of doing stuff.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of, yeah, that sort of lab is something that's been on my mind for a while. But of course, I mean, now with the coronavirus, I'm not really sure,
Hmm.
what. But I was also thinking of the online option, like whether people would like to have that sort of online activity.
Right.
So yeah, I was kind of, I was thinking of something like that. Something educational has always been interesting for me.
Hmm.
um, in educational, but not in the academic world, like,
Right.
outside, where you kind of learn, but not in a rigid system, and people can join freely without feeling the pressure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
So
it's like a school, but not a school. It's like a
it's a,
museum, but not a museum.
it's yeah, it's something that's quite casual, and but where you feel like you will get something out of it, or have a good experience being there.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's and it's a bit of a crossroad where people can, exchange, meet, and have like like kind of accidental findings,
Right.
where you
Right.
kind of, suddenly something gets spoken, and then other people get ideas out of it. So I'm quite curious of trying something like that, but it's just an idea for
Right.
now,
Right.
and it could be that, I really decide to to move forward, and I would need obviously some, collaborators, and
Yeah.
I feel like it would be a team effort, not just
Yeah.
like me, but yeah.
Yeah. Let
So
us know if you, let's say, you are planning to do that, and then I believe
yeah, if you're
we will
interested.
be very very supportive in this sense, because we have been quite interested in this sense. This kind of informal learning is always been quite an interesting realm, because I think a lot of people tend to think, oh, I must go university to learn, but in fact we can learn from another side.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's pretty much about it. And maybe before we end this, Sally, would you mind to share one questions? I mean, I wonder, is there any open question would you like to share?
So I was thinking, I was thinking about it because you asked me to find a question, and I
Yeah.
was thinking, oh, what kind of question can I ask? But it can be anything, right? It doesn't have to be like related to the talk.
No. It could be open. It could be anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was curious about the music that you have in the intro music that you use in
The
your
podcast. Oh.
podcast, and I was wondering if you made it or if it's someone else.
So now the question is seems to be like particular for me.
Did someone else ask this question before?
No. But someone did mention that it's quite interesting because I did ask, there was one architect asked me, how did you do that, the music? So it's very interesting because that music I recorded with my mic very closely to my sketch paper. I use a thicker pen like 0.6 to sketch it over, and the writing that I wrote is actually XYZ. So you hear the kind of thing.
I could figure out it was like a pen, but
Yes.
and then because there's the music. I mean,
Yeah,
still
yeah.
so that also you made the sound.
My friend added some like with the
Ah,
glass, with
okay.
the backpack opening up. So if you listen to it, the front part, the intro is actually a bag putting on a chair. So you are like ready to listen to it. But then in the end, you hear the zip up the bag. So means you are leaving.
Oh, okay.
My friend added that,
Yeah,
but
okay.
for me, I
Now,
just sketch.
okay. I was quite interested to because I have a sound recorder. I bought a sound recorder and I walk around with that thing. And I'm quite interested in sound actually, like how to use sound in in storytelling and this kind of stuff. So I was wondering like whether you would use more sounds in your podcast, or maybe suggest to you
Right.
the use of sound to break your episodes, or to also structure your episodes, because I find the sound, even if it's without words,
Yeah.
just the sound of something,
Yeah.
it does create it kind of makes your mind go somewhere. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's very
I was
interesting.
thinking maybe you should consider the
Oh
sound
yeah.
aspect. Yeah.
It's like a ASMR but without the food. I think the best person you can ask is actually Hazik. Hazik also hosts another podcast. It's called Discomfort.
Okay.
So he actually talks about some stories, little stories, and then it's much more like I always see it as like a diary, but it's you can imagine Hazik as the person who narrate the story. So maybe later on, I'm not sure Hazik would like to share anything else. Okay, so that's pretty much about it. Thanks a lot, Sally. I'm really glad to have you. I think before this conversation, we also talk about this COVID. Also, it brings so much unpleasant experience, I would say, but it also brings us closer in a way because with Zoom and technology, so it's a good thing on the other side, because I think if let's say without this, I might need to visit to France and then get the mic and then record it. Of course, I'm still interested to visit your place, so we'll keep in touch, and then maybe Hazik and I will visit your place one day.
Yeah, you should come. I mean, when the maybe you get a vaccine. Are you still on the waiting list?
I think we usually will be at the end first. Allows
the eldest first, and then. But I think in the UK it's the same as here. They're planning to get everybody vaccinated by the end of the summer.
Yeah, by March or April or something. Yeah.
March or April.
Yeah, they are planning to launch it earlier or something. I'm not sure.
But I think the entire population will be vaccinated before the end of summer.
Yeah. They are planning to do some travel as well, so that's why they wanted to do some vaccine.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Anyway, so thanks a lot, Sally. It's really great to talk to you and your wisdom and your knowledge. So now we will open, anyone who would like to share or ask a questions to Sally. I think it's a rare chance. But even though Sally has been always quite easy to approach, very friendly person.
Thanks for saying that.
So here we have actually quite a diverse crowd, actually, like Alina from Bulgaria, isn't it? From Bulgaria, and also my classmate in Strathclyde University, and Xing from Hong Kong. Also, most of us are doing architecture.
Okay.
Clarissa, a lecturer. So I'm not sure what do you guys think so far.
Hi.
Hi, Elena. Hi.
I wanted to say it was really interesting to hear everything that you talked about. Um, Really fascinating about UNESCO and how you found your way there and the projects that you've worked on. So I was interested about your mixed background and specifically how you it seems you are formed in your um, approach in a lot of ways by you residing in France. So, what lessons did you take from your French background when you were going to work in Asia? And maybe was it in your approach to be more patient or the opposite? I don't really know.
No, French people are not very patient. I think, well, for the French side of my background, I would say that I'm quite, I've been quite exposed to like this idea of social responsibility and, the kind of the commitment to society, these kind of things. I mean, when you grow up in France, you're always from a very young age, you kind of learn about civic duties, political participation. Everything is political, philosophical, social, and and also I think French people have a very big appreciation of world cultures and culture in general. So France is a country that is very supportive of the development of culture in the world. So, for example, in cinema, for example, the French production companies, they finance a lot of films from countries where there is no funding for filmmakers, and especially like countries where there's no freedom of expression. So France is always like this kind of place where it's about freedom, artistic freedom, the lack of boundaries, taboos, very liberal. So when I went to Asia, I think that, the part that came out the most from my French side would be this sort of engagement or social engagement and the awareness of, why cultures are important for the kind of world community. Yeah.
I'm not sure how's it going on from your side, Elena. I mean, do you think I mean, speaking of culture and craft, I'm not sure from your country, is there any movement that you would like to share? I'm not sure.
That's a subject that I'm really interested in, actually, because my country, how can I explain? So we had a socialist background for like 50 years, which really influenced how people look at their culture and heritage. And for a long time, it was the subject was left behind, was not paid attention to, which obviously does a lot of it has a great impact on what can be lost in 50 years.
Right.
So currently, loads of young people are getting more and more into this field of cultural heritage protection and organizing different programs in intangible and tangible heritage as well. So there's very little yet, but there's more and more, and programs such as going into small villages and meeting with the locals to record and to archive their knowledge about folklore, about building techniques, about medicine, stuff like that. So it's still very new. So there's lots to be learned about from different countries and their experience.
Yeah. I do agree when Sally mentioned earlier, it's like a trend. I think it's not a stylist trend, but it's rather a movement. Once people realize the importance of heritage, the importance of the local culture, vernacular materials and stuff. Anyone would like to share? I'm not sure. Maybe we will make one or two last questions.
Hello, can you hear
Hi,
me?
Haziq.
Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, let me try the video. I'm on my phone. So I don't know if it's... Okay.
It's good to meet the moderator and the panelists again.
Yeah.
Yeah, so nice. Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Sally, as well, for sharing your time. I couldn't join in from the start, but I came in halfway through. I just wanted to share like what I thought was maybe what stuck with me the most was how Sally shared that what she wants to do is appreciate the culture so that other people appreciate it themselves too, right? And I think like I resonate with that so much because I'm not someone who I think produces interesting things, but I think everyone else around me does. And I just want them to keep going and keep doing more. So I'm always like a big supporter of people around me, just because it's a motivating thing. I think, like even with Gary with this podcast, I think he's doing a great work, and to kind of just motivate him to keep going. I'll always listen, always supporting, and I think it's so interesting to do that in terms of culture, because to do it on an individual basis, I think it's quite easy. To do that on a bigger scale of culture, especially coming from a mixed background as well. Like I'm not mixed, but I grew up overseas. So when I go back to Malaysia, there's a lot of people who have grown up in Malaysia all their lives, and they forget how special they are. Yeah, I just wanted to share that thought.
Yeah, it's very interesting because Haziq, you shared in the podcast as well. You were born in Malaysia and then you're moving to in Middle East, I think. It's growing up in Middle East.
Yep.
And then now you're working in London. But even though in Malaysia, you are not staying in, I mean, you study in KL, but then you also work with Kelantan, the East Malaysians.
Yeah.
So there's a certain diversity there.
Yeah, it's nice because like going to the rural places, it's difficult. It's very challenging because I look like them. I think, they immediately accept me as one of their own, but I know myself, like I feel the difference, right? Within me, but I have to pretend that I don't because they don't see me as different. So why should I act different? It's kind of what Sally mentioned as well. Like she goes anywhere and she can just fit in. I actually experience the same thing. Like if I go to Thailand, Cambodia, they speak to me in their native language, and then I just look at them.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you could fit into other Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah, there's a lot there to take. But I'm so super excited about the idea of the informal education. I think, like in a way, it's what we're doing now anyway. Like Gary with his podcast.
Yeah, I was thinking of something more hands-on activities where people, like a workshop type of way people would actually develop something, not just talk, but actually make something. There would be a brief, and then people would work on it, and it doesn't have to be something super technical. It could be just exploring a specific thing and then kind of coming up with a narrative, or it could be if it could have different formats. But I was thinking of that as a way also to kind of learn about yourself and kind of understand what you're trying to do, or what you're what you're about, which I think a lot of young people need to figure out what they're good at or what they are interested in. Sometimes people are not sure, they kind of hesitate. So
I wonder if you wanted to convert or transform your part of your house into that space. But I from what I know from some Malaysians, like community library, they often this concern with the neighbor. They don't want the visitors to visit their place. They wanted to try to remain as quiet as it was. So maybe in your place, they always wanted try to, because it's not a tourist, again, it's not a tourist basis.
Well, in the end, but here is quite, there are a lot of Airbnb guest houses around, so I think people don't care so much about having people
they get used to it.
They are used to it, and even now with the coronavirus, there's still people coming in and out. I think they are from Europe or within France,
Right,
So
right.
there's a lot of movement of people with the rolling suitcases. So I think people don't care so much about if they see a few Asians coming by, like, oh, there's an Asian workshop. Maybe they're sewing some outfits or something.
I think they'll start to take more tolerance and capacity slowly.
They think like maybe they're making some masks, face masks.
The
Sorry,
Airbnb
Hazi, you were
is
saying, yeah.
Oh no, the Airbnb is interesting as well because like now Airbnb has the experience part of it, right?
Yeah, they do. I was looking at that, but some of, I don't know, it's just such a mixed bag of stuff. You know?
Yeah.
It's very touristy, and there are a lot of tour guides, just people like, doing like performance shows or like walking people around in the city. And I don't know what kind of audience you get. I was thinking like if you post your thing, and who are you going to get into your classroom?
Yeah.
And you get some kind of weirdo
Yeah.
from, who has no connection to anything that you do, and you have to like put up with that.
Yeah.
It's quite strange because at one point you try to control, but you just can't control it. It's just since you open it,
Especially, I think, especially Airbnb, you don't know what you're gonna get because it's such a broad. It's not a niche market. It's like totally mass.
Yeah.
And the people are from all over the place.
Yeah.
So you really have no idea. Like you just and you don't know about age. You don't know about. I mean, really nothing.
Yeah.
And it's not like you're going to be like, oh no, I don't want people like you.
Yeah.
Or you charge a lot of money. I don't know. Maybe you can charge a lot of money and you get, maybe you make a good outcome out of that.
Well, what you can control only the capacity, like 2 person and more, then you charge at a certain point. But you can't saying that, oh, you are from Asia, I want to charge you lesser kind of thing. It's unfair,
Yeah, no, but it's actually if you have young people who cannot afford to pay a certain amount, because young students probably cannot pay a lot.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe someone who's retired and just wants to do something to kill time probably can pay a lot of money. So that's kind of the difficulty is like, who you're going to target. But maybe the more interesting people don't have any money to pay, so you don't make any money out of it. So you have to, I guess you have to mix. Maybe you make one group, and then, you make the random group, and then you make a group that is more focused.
Yeah.
And who don't necessarily pay a lot, but you can do interesting activities.
Maybe they have to submit like student cards before they register for the Airbnb. Submit a retirement card or something.
Senior card.
Yeah, senior card. Thanks a lot, Haziq, and also Elena. It's really nice to listen to your thoughts as well. So maybe last call. I'm not sure.
Hello.
Hi, Claire. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the conversation just now. I was really interested in the idea of the school as well, so I gave a reference. You can have a look at it later.
Thank you.
It's from Kunchi. It's from Jogja, and they're a great kind of example of kind of a school of improper education, where it's not really school, where they learn kind of practices from below, and that learning should happen by doing as well. So they have really good programs. I just wanted to share that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your idea of creativity and like the creative economy. Has your position changed since your work with UNESCO? Because I too am doing research about it at this current stage, but obviously it has shifted since its proliferance, since its inception from the early 2000s.
What are you? I mean, what are you? Which aspect of creative economy are you searching?
I'm looking at the term creative hub, but I like to look at it more as a collective kind of position. But
well, to be honest, I mean, I haven't really been looking at the creative economy subject very closely in the most recent years. So I wouldn't say that I'm like that I have a lot of updated knowledge about it.
No, that's okay. I guess I'm more interested in how maybe it has changed since your more kind of personal and journalistic endeavors?
Well, I think, back when I was in UNESCO and I was doing the Creative Cities Network, which was very much about the creative economy, I think at the time there was this huge, there was a big hype and trend around this whole thing about, creative economy, how it's going to regenerate a lot of places and boost the economies of different, places. So everybody, especially in Asia, I think a lot of people went crazy and wanted to jump on board. And I know, like in China, there are so many cities that shapes their economy around this idea. Also, like the city of Seoul, there was a mayor in Seoul who was told into design, and he redesigned the city to make it this kind of very creative, innovative place. And I think that happened, let's say around a little bit more than 10 years ago. There was this huge wave, everyone was super excited about it. And I think then there was this kind of plateau, and then eventually I think things became more quiet, or there was a bit of I guess, after the excitement, everything kind of became a bit more I guess less exciting for a lot of people, because people had to figure out what to do next, and they also realized that a lot of money was spent, but there was no real return on the. For example, like in Seoul, I know that a lot of citizens were angry because they made this Zaha Hadid Dongdaemun Plaza.
The design museum.
The design thing, right? And it cost I don't know how many millions or billions. And it was a nightmare to build, and they had to import all of the materials. But it was like a signature piece for the mayor, to say that we are a creative city. And I think that's sort of, the politics behind the creative economy, because a lot of politicians use the creative economy to boost their profile.
Yeah,
exactly.
But it didn't deliver. In the end, the people didn't really benefit from it. It was purely PR. There was a lot of PR around it. Big, PR campaigns and visibility, but there was no real, social impact or improvement. So I think a lot of people were like, oh, that thing is just super shallow. It's superficial. It's all about, designers. It's all about the creative people, but it's nothing for the normal people, the citizens. So I see that, creativity remains something that is considered quite exclusive by the, regular people, if you can say that, which are just the people. Because in a lot of places, like in Chiang Mai, they have this Chiang Mai Design Week. I don't know if you heard of it.
Yeah, I've been there.
Oh yeah, so that one, was it's a really nice event, and I'm, and I've met all the organizers during some past conferences that I made, and there is a lot of enthusiasm around that idea of making Chiang Mai super creative, and using the local kind of community to participate. But I also heard that a lot of the regular citizens don't understand what it's about.
Right.
Because it's Chiang Mai is actually a rural area. The people are not exposed to the arts and design. They don't really know what it's about. They think it's something from Bangkok, or that it's the urban people from Bangkok who brought it. And I guess there is always the sort of separation between the creative community versus the others. And that's something that still needs to be, I guess, the connection between creative people and the audience,
right.
the actual citizens, is still a bit of a gap, I find, in certain contexts, where there is, the access to the creativity is not that that smooth, except for maybe popular culture. I think that's, in terms of creative economy, if you think of pop culture, pop music, there has been a strong, a real
Supporter,
influence. Yeah, I find this the power of pop culture is quite incredible, because, for example, K-pop.
Yeah.
in France. Like K-pop in France is like huge. And these like French girls, they're like totally crazy about BTS and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was traveling to Korea 2 years ago, and there were two young French girls sitting next to me on the plane. And they were like watching Korean dramas and, reality TV on the plane. That's all they watched. Like they didn't watch anything else. And I think it was their first trip to Korea because they were totally excited and they were asking me questions and stuff and saying, oh my God, we're gonna be in the land of our dream. I mean, I was like fascinated because when I was young in France, Asia was like, people couldn't even imagine what Asia was like. Some people, when I was a child, people told me that Japan was strange because people ate raw fish, and they were like, it's strange to eat raw fish. And today they're like eating sushi like crazy, but back in my childhood, it was really unusual. So I think that something like popular culture can make, one generation totally, go into unknown territories, like, so now the K-pop, also Japanese manga culture is really big here.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, creative economy, when you think of creative content and how much it changes, people's perception, I find is quite, internationally, I think it's quite big. Locally, I'm not sure what it's really doing. I find that it has more impact on a global level.
I agree.
Yeah, in terms of this kind of mass culture. But niche cultures always have a hard time to, to be disseminated. People, they remain kind of in the shadows. And then you have these very visible cultures like K-pop, which have altered, in a way, it has altered the pop culture scene. You never had Asian bands in America or Europe perform in like with millions of people, like, screaming. Even 10 years ago, it would be like still quite unusual. I think it started with the Gangnam Style, wasn't that the kind of the first? That was the kind of the first big thing.
Wonder Girls.
Yeah, and I read that Thai pop now it wants to be the new K-pop. So I don't know where that's gonna go, but the Thais are gonna try.
K-pop.
Yeah, I don't know in Malaysia. You have Yuna in Malaysia.
Yeah, but it's not that pop, isn't it? It's much more.
It's not, but it's still part of pop music. It's
Yeah,
not,
it is. Yeah.
It's better than the typical pop, obviously. But she's also like Malaysian, like she's from Malaysia, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but she couldn't really succeed in Malaysia, so she went to America.
Oh.
She's based in the US now, and she like collaborates with American artists.
Yeah, with the big guys, like the big names. But is she popular in Malaysia now after her success in the US, or is she still not
I don't
so?
know.
Less so as mass, like not so much amongst the mass.
Really?
Not so much amongst the Malays anymore, because she doesn't sing in Malay anymore. She used to sing in Malay, and now she sings in English. So it's a transfer of market in a way.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So she's more popular overseas.
Yeah.
Overseas and amongst the English speaking.
Oh yeah. Wow. Yeah, it's interesting.
But I thought it's a very interesting topic. I mean, we could go on that. But in speaking of popular culture wise, right? I think if let's say we apply that into like the so-called less known culture, let's say we are talking about textile or batik or a certain agriculture practice, I think it won't be possible, isn't it? It might be swing into a certain force that you want to economize this a certain practice into somewhere that you don't know, isn't it? Because I always thought K-pop, it must be started somewhere. I believe that before Gangnam Style, there must be a certain period. It was so quiet and silent. And then because of one hit viral, and then it just brings up the whole industry. So,
but it's also music is easier to, people can enjoy music a lot more than textiles. Textiles, unless you make it fashion, and then fashion is, but even fashion, I think, doesn't have the popularity of music, in terms of the numbers. you're never going to get millions of people going to a catwalk. You know, like you would have, like the same with, like any kind of pop star. I think it's hard to compare kind of a material good.
Right.
Yeah.
But for
With,
example, like the rise of popularity of like Uniqlo, for example,
oh
or
yeah.
or Muji, different Asian cuts, I guess, being more popular abroad. And then
Yeah.
if they start to incorporate more patterns like batik, if you start seeing batiks on the runways and on if we're talking about pop culture, then on the shelves, I think.
Yeah. I think it's linked to social media too, because fashion, a lot of, I was fascinated with watching some girls in Seoul who, they take selfies in front of cafes wearing specific clothes just for the purpose of the selfie. I think
Yeah.
it exists all over Asia, but that thing
Yes.
is fascinating to me because I find it really bizarre. For me, it's really strange, but they would like have a Chanel bag or LV, like big brand stuff, and it's really for the Instagram selfie that they're doing it. And they're like go to specific cafes or like pastry shops, and they're like posing in front of those things and taking their photos and buying specific outfits to stage themselves. So I think it's when it becomes that sort of weird trend, maybe people like there is a following, people want to wear, let's say, batik. Or I saw in Indonesia, I find that Indonesian people, like in Bandung, is called the Paris of Java. In Bandung, yeah, it's true. They call
Paris of
themselves
Java.
they're very stylish. But this very interesting thing is that they are wearing their traditional clothes with the jeans, skinny jeans or whatever, So they mix maybe Uniqlo clothes with, they have the scarf or like, and whether they're men or women, they are like super trendy, cool, but in a traditional way. This like mix of new and old. And I find that kind of fashion really maybe specific to that sort of Bandung crowd, that it could also spread into other places in Asia. And I read, I think in Bhutan, there is a fashion blogger, this guy who's a fashion blogger in Bhutan, and he is like the sartorialist, but he's doing it with the local people, like the way they're dressed. And it became this super popular blog of people wearing traditional clothes, textiles, but it's presented in a fashion sense, not as like traditional preservation. And it becomes very different because when you show it as a fashion trend, then people look at it differently.
Yeah.
And this blogger became, a bit of a sensation because he recorded this street style, so-called street style, but all these people are wearing traditional outfits. They're not wearing, jeans, and they're really like, wearing local outfits. And it's quite interesting to see that anything fashion can turn into, even from that sort of traditional background, it can become a bit of a sensation online. So I think there is that sort of, online crossover where you use the platform to show something in a different light.
Actually, that also happened in Malaysia a few years back with this guy called Wat Doyok. I don't know if Gary and Clarissa, if you're familiar. Do you know Wat Doyok?
What do you is the dance, isn't it? Is it?
No, he's a
No, I thought
guy.
it's the. Oh, okay, okay.
WAK, and then DOYOK. But he's less popular now. But there was a time when he became super popular, just because he dressed really well. And in Malaysia, you hardly see that. So he was definitely one of the sartorialists kind of person. And he sported this like really prominent mustache that curls around. And then but he also did it with like traditional Malay clothes as well, but just fitted really nicely, really modern cuts. And he made that really popular. A lot of people started following him as well. So yeah, like what you said, you can definitely see it, this influence And yeah, it goes with the, with social media now we get influencers, and that's exactly what they do. They influence.
Yeah, I think, I mean, not that if I don't know if that really does preserve the original thing, but it definitely creates a wave, and probably, makes people want to buy that thing. Because I also a friend from Myanmar told me that because of Aung San Suu Kyi, a lot of girls from Myanmar wanted to wear the traditional dress because they want to be like her. But it's just like, iconic kind of influence that, you just follow, celebrity influence kind of thing. But I mean, I'm not saying that's necessarily the reason why, people should be doing these kind of traditional, it's not necessarily the best reason, but it does play a role. And I think a lot of the influencers or this celebrity culture does play into the way people behave towards culture. And
I think another open question, maybe we can talk about it next time, is it a good idea if, let's say, what is the moderation that we shouldn't cross too far? When I think, what if folk culture become a pop culture? Would it be a good idea? Because it went beyond a certain spectrum that it becomes no longer who you are. So is it, because I think if we don't push it, then it will face an extinction. But if we don't, then it will go beyond a certain control where it becomes something that we can't recognize anymore. So there is a very...
But you cannot control anything.
Yeah.
It's like, it's almost like a natural evolution.
Yeah.
So the thing, I do believe today that things that disappear are meant to disappear. I mean, it's maybe like, some people may not like to hear that, but actually if something disappears, that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
I think you have to accept it. And it may be sad, oh, this beautiful thing, that people used to make, oh, it was amazing. But in the end, it's like, well, if no one's using it, it's just a museum piece, right?
Yes.
So it's not real culture. If it's not used, it just goes.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that may be a bit of a harsh thing to say. But in the end, we've lived, I mean, there have been thousands of things that have disappeared, in throughout history. And that's just it, it's you cannot force something to exist.
Yeah, and then in speaking of culture, it's a group thing, it's a collective, it's not just one people kind of thing, Yeah. So if that's why when I'm looking up Julia Watson's low tech and also the architecture without architects, and things just disappear, and then what we left is just an archive, is just a documents. In order to practice this, but there are so many factors that stopping you to do that, because just simply talking about climate change or humanity, the personality, the trend, the social medias, it has been changing so much. And if we can recognize social media as a new culture, why can't we accept the old culture that facing the extermination in a way also? I mean, there are so much things that we should talk about. I mean, it's a very complex thing, I would say.
It's very complex, mysterious, and nobody has the answer. It's just gonna keep going.
Yeah.
Until the end, until the world ends, obviously. But
yeah. I mean, there are a lot of things been disappearing. I mean, day by day, we just don't realize it. Okay. Thanks a lot, Sally. I think that pretty much about it for today's session. I think it's a very fruitful discussion and productive one as well. So I will post the ups to Spotify and YouTube. Maybe I think YouTube will be a good idea. So anyway, thanks a lot, everyone, for staying out with us. And I hope you
quite
enjoy.
A long,
It is, but I think it's a very casual one. So we actually talk about it without knowing about the time. So I think that's a beautiful thing. So thanks a lot again, Sally. I think it's really grateful to have you, and I think this is very important, especially for architecture students. We have been talking about culture, but in fact, culture is a huge thing. We can't solve it by built environment. There are a lot of things that can't fix with bricks and mortars. There must be a lot of things we have to talk about. I think that's the beauty of multidisciplinary on cross-disciplinary discussion. So thanks again, Sally. I will keep in touch with you.
Yeah, let's keep in touch.
Thanks a lot. Right. Cheers. See you then.
Cheers.